Thank you so very much for dropping by this video. A warm welcome back to anyone who's been here before, to this channel before, to anyone who's new to this channel. Thanks for dropping by. And to anyone who's new to the work of Bruno Groening, whom this channel is dedicated to, a very special welcome. Bruno Groening was a very dear and precious spiritual teacher who really taught, you could say, a universal spiritual path that someone of any religion, philosophy, or belief could follow. Anyone of any kind of spiritual, that had a spiritual or metaphysical belief, could follow. He really just taught universal spiritual principles. And for some of us, he even, for myself, I'll speak for myself, I was a strict agnostic until I found Bruno's teachings. And then we could say supernatural or the metaphysical or the spiritual became a reality for me. So welcome one and all. And I'm very delighted to be sharing on this topic today. It's one of my, I always say it's one of my favorite Bruno quotes, and I've got like 100 favorite Bruno quotes, but Bruno said, "The good will prevail." The good will prevail. Now, on the surface, does seem like four simple words, like, okay, the good will prevail. But if we take it in the full context that I believe Bruno meant it in, it's a very, very powerful message. Now, first, I would like to say that, normally on this channel, what I do is I share Bruno's teachings and I share my experiences of them. And today I'm going to veer from that a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about history, a little bit about theology. I'm going to interpret Bruno's teachings. He boldly declared the good will prevail and everything will be all right. But he didn't necessarily, to my knowledge, explicitly say what those things mean. So I'm going to share my understanding of them. But before we go there, first and foremost, we're going to go do a little time travel. Welcome to everyone who's joined in. So if we go back to early Christianity, when Christ was still on the earth, and soon after he left, people didn't call it Christianity. They called it the gospel. But they also didn't call it the gospel, because that's an English word. Welcome one and all. The Greek word is evangelio, and I don't know the Hebrew or Aramaic word that they call it, but evangelio means good news or declaration of a victory, kind of like a celebratory declaration of a victory. And you often hear the teachings of Christ called the good news. Or when it's called the gospel, it really isn't, that's not really accurate. It should be called the good news. Jesus didn't, it's written that Jesus said, "I've come to declare the evangelio," which means good news. When we use the word gospel, it kind of loses the meaning. That whatever Christ was here to tell us, that it was good news, and it was news of a declaration of a victory. Hi to the person who said hello. So, but what exactly was that good news? And I'll take questions and comments in a little bit after I'm done speaking. Thank you so much for your participation. So, Christians and Christian thinkers and the disciples and Paul, there was a lot of discussion about, well, what is the good news? What does that mean? And by about 300 or 400 AD, there was some disagreement. There was the majority of, and again, this is my understanding, history is not my specialty, but there were, well, let me put it this way, this is a historical fact. There were 6 different main interpretations of what the good news were. 4 of those said that the good news was that everyone would be saved. One of those taught eternal damnation, and one of those taught eternal destruction. So today, it's completely opposite. Most Christians believe in eternal destruction or eternal torment. And it's heartbreaking that once upon a time the majority of Christians believed in universal salvation, and that now most believe in eternal torture or destruction. But over the last 150 years, Christians have been waking up to the history and also to just how horrible this idea of eternal torture or damnation is. And people have been doing research and realizing, wow, early Christians actually believed that everyone would be saved, that was the good news. That was the essence of the message of what Christ taught. And so I was raised in that. I was raised with that belief, very, very fire and brimstone kind of church. And then over time, I slowly started to question and reject it. And I didn't even know that there was a word for it. People who believe in this idea of universal salvation or universal reconciliation are called universalists. At least that's the modern term. In the early days, they would just be called people who believe the gospel or the good news. But so most of us have inherited this idea that God punishes, that God, if you fall short in some way, you're going to be tortured forever or destroyed forever with no hope of redemption. Even if we've rejected that consciously, that's the culture, that's the predominant paradigm on the world today. A majority of Christians and a majority of Muslims believe it, and it's a very sad state of affairs. So most of us who are on the spiritual path don't believe that, don't agree with that. But we maybe never really thought it through, this idea, will everyone ultimately find their way home? As it's talked about in the Bible, the prodigal son was completely welcomed back into the Father's home. But the question is, will everyone be a prodigal son? Will everyone be welcomed home? Well, early Christians said yes. I believe that, I'm convinced that that's what Christ actually taught. There's about 120 verses that proclaim everyone will be saved. There's about 15 to 20 verses that say many people will be doomed or tortured forever. I'm talking about the Bible right now. But most of those verses are mistranslations. Most of them disappear when you go back to the original Greek or Hebrew. So when you go back to the Greek or Hebrew, there's about 3 or 4 verses that say some people will be tortured. And then you've got about 120 verses that say everyone will be saved. So that's kind of the background. So now let's come to a little more in the present time. Bruno Groening comes. He teaches that God doesn't punish, which first of all is a very radical teaching, because the majority of the people in this world, I won't say for the last 2,000 years, or maybe for the last 1,500 years, the idea of a wrathful, punishing God has been the primary paradigm on this planet. And yet Bruno Groening comes and says, God never punishes. Bruno said, but he does allow hardships that act as a reparation, which means a repairing or a repayment for past harm, or that serve a lesson. So Bruno didn't teach God never punishes, so nothing bad ever happens. Because that's not the case. Bad things do happen, right? But Bruno gives us a very different explanation of why negative things happen, and of what is, on the one hand, you've got this idea of God punishing, and then you've got a kind of a new age idea of like no harm, like everything's good, And so Bruno taught very clearly that actions have consequences, and that those consequences are in alignment with what was done. As he said, you reap what you sow. So Bruno taught God never punishes. He taught you reap what you sow. He taught that while God doesn't punish, he allows many a hardship for the sake of reparation or for learning. And then lastly, he said the good will prevail. Everything will be all right. So was Bruno teaching the same good news that Christ was, that everyone will be saved, that everyone will be redeemed, in language that we as friends of Bruno Groening might be familiar with? Will everyone be healed, completely healed one day? My conviction is yes. I can't prove that. I can't prove that Bruno taught it. He never, to my knowledge, explicitly said everyone, that the words I'm using, that everyone will be healed or everyone will be redeemed, but he certainly pointed in that direction. He spoke about the complete healing of this planet, that all evil would be cleansed from this planet. And this is talked about so beautifully in the Bible, that all evil and suffering and pain would be cleansed from this planet to such an extent that the lamb and the lion would lie down together, that children would play near a nest of vipers, and they would even stick their hand, vipers being snakes, poisonous snakes, stick their hand into a nest of vipers, and they would not be harmed. So the Bible and Bruno point to this complete restoration of the earth. And, when Bruno talked about people going down the wrong path, he didn't say they would be lost forever or damned. He said they would become lost for a long period of time. That if you really go down the wrong path, and you get off the divine path and go on to the negative path, that you would be lost for a period of time. So that's very different than sort of the vengeful religious idea of be tortured forever or be destroyed forever. So did Bruno teach the same good news that early Christians believe in and that I'm convinced Christ actually taught? That's for each one of us to search our hearts and decide for themselves. I'm convinced he did. He taught that the nature of God is goodness, is love, is Ordnung, a German word meaning harmony, order, balance. And so this topic is of such importance to me personally, because Bruno taught us to listen to God and to follow God, but it's very hard to listen to, follow, or surrender to God if we don't trust God. And it's very hard to trust God if we believe that God gives out unjust and you could say horrific punishments that don't meet the crime. What could a person do to warrant eternal punishment with no hope of redemption? And what does that say about God? Is God truly a loving parent if God gives up on its own children? To my answer, no. And so of interest is, to understand, well, first of all, before finding Bruno's teachings, I've been fascinated by different types of spiritual teachings in different religions. And so I'd studied quite a bit of Vedic philosophy, which is maybe the Vedic tradition, which is a more accurate word for Hinduism. And when you talk to Hindus about the idea of someone being damned or lost forever, they just look at you confused, because see, we in the West can say God is all good, But in Vedic philosophy, in Hindu philosophy, they've believed and practiced that for, you know, with recorded history for a solid 3,000 to 4,000 years. And in the Vedic tradition claims that this goes back tens of thousands of years, long before recorded history. So it's so embedded in their culture that the divine is completely pure. And within that framework, within that view, it's not even possible to conceive that the divine would abandon one of its children, that there's any person out there who's beyond redemption. Like, it's just inconceivable. If you say such a thing to a Hindu or someone who follows the Vedic tradition, they just look at you kind of confused, as if you're speaking gibberish, because it's so fundamental to their paradigm, the goodness of God. Now, in that sense, Bruno did teach something similar. He taught that the divine is love, life, order, harmony, goodness. And that divinity is everywhere, and in, not just everywhere, but in everything. That means that the divine is inside of you and me, and that cabinet, and this phone, or whatever device that you are, that there's intense connection, that the divine permeates everything. And so part of why this is so meaningful to me is because while I consciously rejected the idea of eternal damnation, there's still been there's kind of releasing it on a deeper level. You could say releasing it from your nervous system. Or it's one thing to consciously, but I was raised in that and believed that for the first 20 years of my life. So in my case, there's definitely been a cleansing or a releasing of that. So I hope this is helpful to others. And again, I normally don't, I like to keep this channel just dedicated to Bruno's teachings, and not try and put my interpretation on them, just to the best of my ability. I'm a human being, I can't not. But today I felt inspired to speak to this topic, and also to speak to those people who are releasing and healing. You could say healing those old, very painful ideas of a God that tortures or punishes. Bruno was adamant that God never punishes. He said it over and over and over again. And that doesn't mean there's no consequences to our negative actions and our harmful actions. But just like Eastern philosophy, the response, it's not so much a punishment as a response. Like, here's an earplug. If I release my fingers, the earplug falls. That's a consequence of the action. And if I do harm, in this view, in doing harm is going to come back to me, not as a punishment, but as literally a natural consequence of what I did. Thank you so very much for joining in. Once again, I hope this was helpful to others, and I wish you a blessed, blessed day. Thank you so much for dropping by.